The film was universally received in Rwanda at the time. A year later, Paul's book, An Ordinary Man, came out, in which Paul criticized the electoral success of President Kagame, where he received 96% of the vote. And from that moment on, Hotel Rwanda became the center of a disinformation campaign, mostly in Rwanda, but some of it in the United States. The film that we had created was not true. In particular, the New Times newspaper mounted a continuous campaign. They went back to the people that I had interviewed and had them change their statements about what had taken place. This was a classic example of manipulation of media to turn the truth on its head. Clearly, the government had decided, once Paul had become an activist against what was taking place in Rwanda, that the film had to be denounced, and denounced as untrue. There were numerous articles put out by the Rwandan government in various newspapers in the United States. I responded to them right away, and each time I responded, I presented the facts, and there was no challenge to what I was saying. The fact of the matter is, what people watched in Hotel Rwanda is what basically took place within that hotel at the time, under the constraints of making a feature film about an event that spread over 2 months. And it was clear to me that Paul's challenge and his fame, his challenge to President Kagame's political activities in Rwanda was clearly the reason that the film was being denounced. On several occasions, President Kagame himself denounced Paul. And since that time, since the time of the denunciation of the film, both Paul Rusesabagina's human rights activities have grown, and President Kagame and the Rwandan government's denunciation of the film and attacks against Paul have grown as well. And I think that this, as we see authoritarianism grow around the world, whether it's in North Korea or in Russia or in Africa, this is a classic example of where we have to stand up for the truth. And we have to stand up for an individual who fought for other people and defend Paul, and we must rally around him to get him out of prison now. Because if Paul Rusesabagina suffers in prison, we all suffer. And the whole notion of truth, the whole notion of telling the truth through movies, through television, of propagating the activities of human rights activists will be destroyed. We can't. This is a bigger issue. It's an issue for Hollywood. It's an issue for Washington. It's an issue for Brussels. And I, for one, will continue to fight to have Paul released and hopefully save his life. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you so much for that impassioned plea from somebody who really dug so deeply and personally into all the facts of the case, and who knows so much the power of film and the power of lies. And I just cannot thank you enough for your intervention, and also for your whole life's work.
Really, from the moment that Paul was kidnapped, this was over. No fair process begins with a defendant being abducted, illegally rendered, never given an arrest warrant, and then being, tied up, starved, physically tortured, coerced to make a false confession. At this point, it was already done. But as we now know, apart from what was happening to Paul in secret in Kigali behind closed doors, the violations of his right as an accused just continued in plain sight. And it would have been such an easy thing to give Paul the lawyers of his choosing, to give him a copy of the case file, to let him see a witness list, to let his lawyers bring him documents, to let him hold documents, sign documents. To this day, he still isn't allowed to do that. It would have been an easy thing not to harass his lawyers, not to harass his family, not to put Pegasus on their phone, and for the president of Rwanda not to stand up on the morning the trial started and say on national television, Paul is guilty and he will pay. These are easy things. These are basic things. These are prerequisite components of any competent, impartial, independent judicial system, and they were missing in Paul's case. There were lots of questions about why this is happening. You know, is he a terrorist? They're saying he's a terrorist. Why is he going to trial? Surely they must have some evidence. He wouldn't be in court if there wasn't some evidence against him. I'm going to spend my last minute just putting that to bed. We watched the trial. We have a copy of the prosecution case file. We have the judgment. There is no credible evidence of any criminal or terrorist activity on behalf of Paul Rusesabagina, which is why, coming full circle, the Rwandan government was required to kidnap him to even get him in front of a court of law.
In its opinion in Paul's case, the working group asserts that his detention was arbitrary under 4 different categories. In the first category, the working group asserts that it is clearly impossible to invoke any legal basis justifying Rwanda's deprivation of Paul's liberty. The opinion concludes that abducting and holding Paul at a location unknown to his family and lawyers is a deprivation of liberty analogous to enforced disappearance, and it lacks any valid legal basis under any circumstance. The second category, the working group asserts that Mr. Rusesabagina's deprivation of liberty is or was an attempt to curb his dissent by intimidating him and others associated with his work. It affirms that his situation was a result of the exercise of his right to freedom of opinion and expression. In the third category, the working group found that Rwanda failed to observe international norms relating to the right to fair trial, as is further elucidated in the trial watch report that Kate spoke about. Finally, the working group found that Mr. Rusesabagina's detention and treatment was discriminatory, as he was targeted for his activism as a human rights defender and his political opposition to the government. The working group requests, through its opinion, that the Rwandan government immediately releases Mr. Rusesabagina, accords him the right to compensation and other reparations in accordance with international law, and conducts a full and independent investigation into Mr. Rusesabagina's arbitrary deprivation of liberty. Freeing Rusesabagina is the working group's request. Freeing Rusesabagina is the right thing to do. Freeing Rusesabagina is a requirement under international law. Thank you.
The Kagame regime in Rwanda is one of the world's worst perpetrators of transnational oppression. And the people most at risk, the Rwandans most at risk, are human rights defenders like Paul, independent journalists, and regime critics. And that repression comes around the world in many forms: digital surveillance, spyware attacks, harassing exiled people's families inside and outside of the country, and even assassination. And in many cases, authoritarian governments will use false pretenses or threats to lure its target out of the country where they live, where they've sought asylum, and into a neutral third country. And from there, they kidnap them back to their country of origin, subjecting them to trials which are most often not free and fair, and imprisonment, or even worse. And this is unquestionably what has happened to Paul Rusesabagina. when the government of Rwanda decided that his human rights advocacy, his courage, his willingness to tell the truth, the way his account of the 1994 genocide differs from the official story, and his outspoken criticism of President Kagame, all of those things combined with his global prominence after the movie Hotel Rwanda, all of those made him a threat to the regime, or so they believed. A threat really just for simply speaking the truth. And in August 2020, all of us followed the events that unfolded there when Paul was living in Texas, and he was invited by a friend to speak at a church in Burundi, where he would travel by private plane. And then after his layover in Dubai, that plane flew to, not to Burundi, but to Rwanda. And we've heard from Kate and from others about how the trial and others have really been a denial of the basic freedoms, on top of what has unquestionably been the regime's willingness to use transnational repression. President Kagame isn't even trying to hide that he has done this. He's actually bragging about it. He has called his plan to bring Paul Rusesabagina back to Rwanda flawless. The government has actually been using transnational repression since the 1990s, and we know that they've physically targeted Rwandans in at least 7 other countries since 2014, mostly in Africa. But Rwandans living as far away as the United States, Canada, and Australia fear surveillance and retribution. And the case of Paul Rusesabagina shows us that they are right to do so, because people are not safe outside of their own countries. We have to hold authoritarian regimes to account when they use tools like transnational repression, when they take political prisoners, simply to target and silence their critics. We join in calling for the release of Paul Rusesabagina. And if we do not stand against authoritarians who use transnational repression, who take political prisoners, we know that life will continue to get worse for human rights defenders who try to speak the truth all around the world. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you for your insights into transnational repression and the tactics of the Rwandan government.
That when the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice in 2011 chose Paul Rusesabagina as the winner of the Lantos Human Rights Prize because he exemplified what it means to heroically shine a light in the midst of darkness and brutality, and he was exactly the sort of international human rights icon that we wanted to honor with our highest award, we became a target, the Lantos Foundation, of threats, of intimidation, of tactics that were absolutely shocking on the part of the Rwandan government. Here, an American human rights organization with no connection to Rwanda, other than the choice that we had made to honor this brave Rwandan, ourselves experienced some of that transnational intimidation. So only imagine how truly frightening it is for people in the Rwandan diaspora to be on the receiving end of these tactics. I want to take a moment to thank and to pay tribute to you, Terry George, for the extraordinary film that you made that told this inspiring story again of light shining in the darkness, of man's capacity for decency and courage in the face of terror and overwhelming odds. And I think I can say with no hesitation whatsoever that but for the film that you made and that Don Cheadle brought to life with his brilliant performance, Paul Rusesabagina would not be alive today. Paul Rusesabagina is alive because you told his story and told it in such a compelling way that it became the shorthand for the story of the whole tragedy of the Rwandan genocide globally. To this day, all you need to say, because not everybody knows the name Rusesabagina, you say, Hotel Rwanda, the hero of Hotel Rwanda, and suddenly their faces light up. They say, oh yes, we know, we understand. Now the reality is that there is a shockingly long list now of victims of Paul Kagame. Those who dare to speak out, and as you said, Nicole, it is political opposition figures, critics, journalists. That's sort of the universe of people. And it is a longer list than I could recite right now of those who have disappeared, been imprisoned, been assassinated, been tortured. And Paul has now joined that list as he has become a victim of a kidnapping, a sham trial, torture in custody. And I fear with every fiber of my being that the goal is for him to die in prison under unspeakable conditions. So I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I do feel that the time has come to tell the second chapter of the story. I think the time has come, whether it's you, Terry, with your extraordinary gift for bringing to life stories we need to know, we need to be inspired by. Dawn, whether it's part of your mission to tell the next chapter, but it is now on us. At that moment when 1,100 people needed Paul to find all of his decency and courage to interpose himself between them and the forces of death and destruction, he did it. It is now incumbent on all of us to meet the moment as well. Some of our viewers may notice that I'm wearing, and I'll sit up so you can see it, I'm very proud to be wearing a free Paul Rusesabagina t-shirt. This is just a symbol of a movement that we want to seed and to feed and to build so that there will be tens of thousands of people, famous and unknown, wearing these t-shirts, telling this story, reaching out to your representatives in Congress, reaching out to the media, because this is a brave man who did what we all hope we would have done in his shoes, but he did it. And he has paid a price for doing it because he has become the target of a powerful man, the leader of Rwanda, who sadly has not lived up to the hopes we all had, that he would not only be a healer of his country, but a leader who would lead with rule of law and democratic principles. He has become a dictator, and Paul has become his top target. So let us now follow in Paul Rusesabagina's very brave footsteps. Let us step forward. Let us interpose ourselves between Paul and a machinery of injustice that has sought to make him the latest victim. And I'm honored to be here with such a distinguished group of people all working together to free Paul Rusesabagina.
Thank you, Katrina, and thank you for that. So I'm going to start here with you, Terry. Why do you think Paul was kidnapped, and why was he a target of the Rwandan regime?
Because he was, along with Paul Kagame, the most famous Rwandan perhaps in the world, and he represented the opposition to the Kagame regime. So he was the prize, he was the golden prize to be taken out, and that's why this elaborate kidnapping was organized. Paul represented the voice of exiled Rwandans around the world, and we've seen how ruthless Paul Kagame's regime has been. In South Africa, they committed assassinations. In Rwanda, the most famous gospel singer in Rwanda died in prison. There's just a litany of stuff, and Paul represented the focal point of opposition to Kagame, so he had to be taken out.
Thank you, Terry. Dawn, to you, apart from your personal link to Paul's story, why do you feel so strongly today that you are advocating on Paul's behalf?
Well, there is a Lao Tzu quote in the Tao Te Ching that states, "In action, watch the timing." And from the first day I learned about Paul's enveiglement and imprisonment, I started making phone calls to his family, to politicians, to friends of President Kagame, to lawyers, to organizations, basically to anybody I thought could help find a solution to this. I also simultaneously began to try to get my hands on information about the charges that Paul was accused of and try to find independent sources, if there were any, that could refute or even corroborate what was being claimed by the Rwandan government. And that was very difficult to do. But one thing was clear: they had him now, and they weren't going to let him go. Not without first giving him a trial. None of us were very encouraged by that. You know, a trial post-entrapment sounded like anything but fair, but if there was any hope, it was that irrespective of the way Paul was taken to Rwanda, there would at least now be an opportunity to have the facts laid out, witnesses and evidence presented, and for Paul to have the ability to mount a defense with a legal team of his choosing. You know, there would be a proceeding for the entire world to see and ultimately, engage with if it was determined that this was indeed a bad act. There would be on record something we could all point to that might compel the world to respond. Of course, that didn't happen. The trial was, all but a show, and the world's attention writ large has been focused on the pandemic, elections, strong men around the world, January 6th, the Super Bowl, and a host of other events that over the last 640 days, have been fighting for eyes and attention in this 24-hour news cycle. So here we are now, trying to collectively make noise, shine a light, draw attention to the circumstances, and we're hoping it's not too late. The judge presiding over Paul's case recently rejected the prosecution's appeal to increase Paul's sentence from 25 years to life, a decision that, on the face of it, might seem hopeful, but given Paul's state of health, it's all but irrelevant. If we're unable to persuade President Kagame to intercede and intervene on Paul's behalf, he will likely die in prison, and that would be awful. So we're all here now hoping to prevent that from occurring, not just for Paul and his family, but also for the cause of justice in general.
Thank you, Don. Katrina, Paul is a U.S. permanent resident and a Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient. He is also a victim of transnational repression, but Rwanda is not an enemy state. They are an ally of the United States. With that said, why hasn't the United States government brought Paul home? If someone like Paul is kidnapped and our government does not put enormous pressure to bring him home immediately, what hope do other wrongfully detained U.S. citizens have if they are taken captive?
Well, you put your finger on something critically important. Our government has not stepped up to do what it must do. The United States has enormous influence and enormous leverage over Rwanda. Rwanda is a small country, tremendously dependent on international goodwill, international financial support. And I believe that if our State Department and if our White House had exerted the full extent of their leverage, Paul would not have been languishing under appalling circumstances for well over 500 days. We need to ramp up the pressure on our own government. I'm encouraged that there are increasingly leaders in Congress who are now not only speaking out, but they're using some of those keywords. They're saying foreign aid will not be approved. We will put a hold on this. We will stop U.S. government support for the government of Rwanda until this U.S. permanent resident is released and returned to his family. It is inexcusable when we do not use our enormous leverage to free an international human rights hero. It's frustrating to me as a human rights activist when we don't do everything we can against big and powerful enemies or adversaries like China or Russia. But it's incomprehensible when we don't do it towards small and very dependent allied countries who really need to listen to what the United States says when we say, you are unlawfully holding this man. We demand his release. He's a permanent U.S. resident. And if you want our support and our joint cooperation on many things to continue, you need to be responsive to this demand now. So no excuses, the pressure needs to be increased.
Thanks. Thank you, Katrina. And Kate, we've been talking a lot about the trial and about due process violations, but in the end, is this really a legal matter? Isn't it more a political issue? And what needs to be done next?
Yes. No one who's followed this case would recognize it as a legitimate legal process. This is the deliberate targeting of an activist, someone who says things that the regime doesn't like or asks questions to which there aren't easy answers. So what we've seen isn't a normal arrest, trial, appeal. We see the removal of an opponent from public space, the silencing of a critic. And that's entirely political. That is extrajudicial. And we've heard from Terry and Nicole and Katrina that this isn't unique to Paul. He is one person on a growing list inside and outside of Rwanda who have spoken up and been arrested and disappeared or killed. What do we do next? It's important that we recognize that it's happening. It's important that more and more people can see now and recognize that it's happening, and we just can't stop talking about it until this practice itself ends.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You've heard Paul's story, and I hope this has moved you to action. As I said earlier, we need to make sure that the Rwandan government, the US government, the Belgian government, and the world hear the words of these reports. Of Paul's rights were violated, and he should be released immediately. Those of us on this panel today are working hard for his release. Some of us are wearing the free Rusesabagina t-shirts, and those are available for others. We have also been joined by many of our friends in Hollywood, in the arts, and in public life, and we hope you will join us as well. We will be tweeting about Paul, and we need everyone to retweet free Rusesabagina. The message needs to get out on social media starting now, and you can share your thoughts and create your own messages. You can join the campaign by buying a t-shirt, calling the White House at 202-456-1414. You can sign the change.org petition and share it with your friends, with your families, and on social media. And for more information, you can go to www.paulr.org. That's www.paulr.org. We need to make Paul's name and cause household words. Please help however you can. And again, I want to thank our panelists. I want to especially thank Annalise. You're closest to Paul. He's your dad. We love you so much for coming here. Our hearts are with you. Our hearts are with you. We will not stop until your dad is free. We want you to know that. We're all in this together. We're working with you shoulder to shoulder to free Paul. Thank you so much, everybody.